In the early years of the Second World War, the skies over Europe belonged largely to the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots were not just servicemen, they were celebrities. Their victories were counted carefully, their names printed in newspapers, their photographs circulated as proof of German air superiority. Among this generation of combat aviators was Walter Wolfram, a Bavarian pilot who would eventually be credited with 137 aerial victories, the vast majority of them on the Eastern Front. By the time the air war shifted decisively over Germany itself, Wolfram was no inexperienced flyer. He was a seasoned ace who had survived hundreds of combat missions in the cockpit of the Messerschmitt Bf-109. The Bf-109 had been the backbone of German fighter aviation since the Spanish Civil War. Designed in the 1930s, compact and lightweight, it was built around performance. Its Daimler-Benz engine gave it strong climb capability, and in the hands of an experienced pilot, it was deadly in vertical maneuvers. Early in the war, against opponents in Poland, France, and even during the Battle of Britain, the aircraft proved formidable. German tactics emphasized energy fighting: climb, dive, strike, and climb again. In that environment, pilots like Wolfram thrived. But by 1943, the character of the air war had changed dramatically. The United States Army Air Forces were sending large formations of heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, deep into occupied Europe and eventually toward the German homeland. Initially, these bombers flew without reliable long-range fighter escort. German pilots exploited that vulnerability with devastating effect. Interceptions over Schweinfurt and Regensburg demonstrated that unescorted bombers could be shot down in alarming numbers. To Luftwaffe fighter units, it seemed proof that Germany could still defend its skies. Yet even during these apparent successes, warning signs were emerging. German industry was being forced into defensive production. Experienced pilots were becoming harder to replace. Fuel shortages were beginning to limit training hours for new recruits. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft production was expanding at a staggering rate. The United States alone was producing tens of thousands of aircraft per year by 1944. Quantity did not automatically mean quality, but the balance was shifting. Wolfram, flying mostly against Soviet forces earlier in the war, had built his reputation in brutal, close-range combat. On the Eastern Front, distances were vast, airfields were rough, and engagements were frequent. Survival required aggression and instinct. Victories were often achieved at low altitude, sometimes in chaotic dogfights over advancing ground forces. By the time he returned to defend the Reich itself, he brought with him experience, but also the habits of a different kind of air war. When American daylight bombing intensified over Germany in 1944, something else appeared in the skies. At first, German pilots encountered P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings escorting bombers part of the way. These fighters were dangerous, but they lacked the range to accompany the bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany. Luftwaffe fighter units learned to wait until escort fighters turned back, then strike the vulnerable bomber formations. It was a calculated system, and for a time it worked. Then came the aircraft that would change everything: the P-51 Mustang, equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license in the United States by Packard. With drop tanks extending its range beyond 1,000 miles, the Mustang could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. For the first time, German interceptors could no longer rely on gaps in fighter coverage. The bombers were no longer alone. Pilots like Wolfram began noticing a difference in the quality and persistence of Allied escort fighters. The P-51 combined high speed, excellent high-altitude performance, and long range. Its laminar flow wing design reduced drag, increasing efficiency at cruising speeds. Armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, it was heavily armed,
but still agile. More importantly, it could remain with the bomber formations throughout the entire mission, engaging German fighters before they could organize effective attacks. This was not merely a technical problem, it was a psychological one. The Luftwaffe had been built on offensive doctrine, on the idea that German pilots would dictate the terms of combat. Now, increasingly, they were reacting rather than initiating. Fuel shortages worsened as Allied bombing targeted synthetic fuel plants. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer training hours than their predecessors. Losses mounted. Veteran aces were forced into defensive battles over their own cities. Walter Wolfram, with his 137 victories, represented the old guard of Luftwaffe fighter strength. He had proven himself repeatedly in combat. But even for an experienced ace, the sky over Germany in 1944 was different from the sky over the Eastern Front in 1942. American formations were larger, escorts were more aggressive, and numerical superiority was overwhelming. German pilots could still inflict losses, but they were increasingly fighting a war of attrition they could not win. By mid-1944, Allied fighters were not only escorting bombers, they were roaming freely, attacking airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground, and disrupting takeoffs and landings. The air war had shifted from interception to survival. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced the possibility that technological and industrial superiority had passed permanently to the enemy. It was within this context that a captured P-51 Mustang would eventually come under German examination. For pilots like Wolfram, the question was no longer whether the aircraft was dangerous. That had already been proven in combat. The real question was deeper. Had the balance of air power shifted so completely that even Germany's most experienced aces could not reverse it? The answer would not come from propaganda reports or optimistic briefings. It would come from a test flight, from a direct comparison between the trusted Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the American fighter that now shadowed every bomber formation. And for a man who had spent years mastering one of Germany's most respected aircraft, stepping into the cockpit of the enemy's machine would reveal far more than technical specifications. It would reveal the uncomfortable truth about the future of the air war over Europe.
In 1940, as Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, an unusual request crossed the Atlantic. The British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with a proposal to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license for the Royal Air Force. Instead of simply producing an existing design, North America's president promised something far more ambitious, a completely new fighter aircraft designed and built in a remarkably short time. That decision would lead to the birth of the P-51 Mustang, an aircraft that at first seemed unremarkable and later would transform the air war over Europe. The prototype, known as the NA-73X, flew for the first time in October 1940, just 102 days after the contract had been signed. It was an extraordinary engineering achievement. The Mustang's sleek fuselage and carefully designed air intake system reflected advanced aerodynamic thinking. One of its most innovative features was the laminar flow wing, developed using research from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Unlike conventional wings, which created greater drag as air flowed over their surface, the Mustang's wing was shaped to maintain smoother airflow for longer distances across the chord. In theory, this reduced drag and improved high-speed efficiency. Early operational versions of the Mustang, however, were powered by the Allison V1710 engine. At low and medium altitudes, the aircraft performed well. It was fast, stable, and had excellent range compared to many contemporary fighters. The Royal Air Force used it effectively for reconnaissance and ground attack missions. But at high altitudes, above 15,000 feet, its performance dropped off significantly. The single-stage supercharger of the Allison engine limited its ability to compete with German fighters in the thin air where strategic bombing missions took place. At this stage, the Mustang was promising but not decisive.
it was not yet the aircraft that would escort bombers deep into Germany. Meanwhile, American daylight bombing doctrine depended on heavily armed bombers defending themselves in tight formations. Experience in 1943, especially during missions like Schweinfurt, proved that even well-armed bombers could suffer unsustainable losses without continuous air escort. The United States Army Air Forces needed a long-range fighter capable of accompanying bombers all the way to their targets and back. Existing American fighters simply could not go the distance. The turning point came when British engineers experimented with fitting the Mustang airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin had already proven itself in aircraft like the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane during the Battle of Britain. Unlike the Allison, the Merlin used a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, allowing it to maintain strong performance at high altitude. When installed in the Mustang, the results were dramatic. Test flights revealed a significant increase in maximum speed, climb rate, and high-altitude capability. The transformation was so impressive that the United States moved quickly to produce the Merlin under license. The Packard Motor Car Company began manufacturing the engine in America, ensuring large-scale production. The new variant, designated the P-51B and later the P-51D, combined aerodynamic efficiency with powerful high-altitude performance. It could reach speeds over 430 miles per hour and operate effectively above 25,000 feet, precisely where bomber formations needed protection. Range, however, was the Mustang's true strategic advantage. With internal fuel capacity already strong and the addition of external drop tanks, the aircraft could fly escort missions exceeding 1,000 miles. This meant that bombers departing from England could be protected all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, German interceptors would face Allied fighters over targets they once believed were beyond escort coverage. The Mustang's armament also reflected practical combat experience. The P-51D variant carried 6.5 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings, providing substantial firepower with reliable ammunition feed systems. Earlier wing-mounted guns in some American fighters had experienced jamming issues during high-G maneuvers, but refinements improved reliability. Combined with excellent visibility from the bubble canopy introduced on later models, the aircraft offered pilots both offensive capability and situational awareness. Production numbers underscored the scale of the Allied industrial response. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 Mustangs had been built. Factories operated at extraordinary output levels, supplying aircraft not only to American units, but also to Allied forces. While Germany struggled with fuel shortages and bombing disruptions to its own production lines, the United States expanded manufacturing capacity across multiple states, protected by distance from enemy attack. By late 1943 and early 1944, the Mustang was entering combat in increasing numbers. Escort groups equipped with the new fighters began accompanying heavy bombers deep into occupied Europe. German pilots initially underestimated the newcomer. It was another American aircraft, they believed, fast perhaps, but manageable. Yet reports soon indicated something different. The Mustangs did not turn back. They remained. They climbed aggressively to meet interceptors before attacks could form. They pursued German fighters all the way down to low altitude if necessary. The development of the Mustang was not a single breakthrough moment, but a chain of calculated engineering decisions. Aerodynamic efficiency, engine selection, fuel capacity, and industrial production all combined into one system. It wasn't simply faster or better armed, it was strategically suited to the demands of long-range escort warfare. In air combat, performance is measured in seconds and meters. In strategic bombing, it is measured in miles. The Mustang mastered both. As 1944 approached, the presence of long-range escorts fundamentally altered the air war's balance. Bombers were no longer isolated over Germany. Luftwaffe pilots could no longer rely on predictable windows of vulnerability. For experienced aces like Walter Wolfram, the appearance of this aircraft signaled a new phase of combat, one where technical innovation and industrial capacity would weigh heavily as individual skill. What began as a bold promise in 1940 had become the backbone of Allied air superiority. The P-51 Mustang was no longer just an experimental design with aerodynamic refinements. It was a long-range guardian, reshaping the skies over Europe and setting the stage for confrontations that would force even Germany's most seasoned pilots to reassess the balance of power in the air.
By the time a captured P-51 Mustang was made available for evaluation, German fighter pilots already knew its reputation. They had seen it slicing through bomber formations, diving out of the sun and chasing Messerschmitts all the way back to their own airfields. But combat impressions were one thing. Sitting inside the aircraft, feeling its controls, testing its responses, was something entirely different. For Walter Wolfram, a veteran with 137 victories in the Messerschmitt Bf 109, climbing into the cockpit of an enemy fighter was not simply technical curiosity. It was a confrontation with the machine that had begun to dominate Germany's skies. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had always been built around compact efficiency, its narrow fuselage wrapped tightly around the Daimler-Benz engine. The cockpit was cramped, visibility to the rear was limited, and the landing gear was notoriously narrow, making takeoffs and landings demanding. But experienced pilots accepted these traits. They valued the aircraft's climb rate and acceleration. In the hands of an expert, the Bf 109 could be deadly in vertical combat. When Wolfram first examined the captured Mustang, the physical contrast was immediate. The P-51's cockpit felt spacious by comparison. The seating position was more comfortable, the layout more intuitive. Later P-51D variants featured a bubble canopy that provided excellent all-around visibility, something German pilots often lacked in their framed canopies. According to post-war accounts, Wolfram described the cockpit as disconcerting, not because it was inferior, but because it was unfamiliar. It represented a different philosophy of design, one that emphasized pilot comfort and visibility alongside performance. As he prepared for flight, he would have noticed the careful engineering details, clearly arranged instruments, effective heating and ventilation systems, and a layout designed for long missions. German fighters were often optimized for short, sharp engagements close to base. The Mustang, by contrast, had been built for endurance. Escort missions could last hours. Pilot fatigue was a real factor in air combat, and the American designers had accounted for it. Once airborne, the differences became even clearer. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built in the United States by Packard, delivered strong, high-altitude performance thanks to its two-stage supercharger. At altitude, where bomber escorts operated, the Mustang retained power and responsiveness. Wolfram, accustomed to the Bf 109's characteristics, would have felt the smooth acceleration and stable handling at cruising speeds. The laminar flow wing reduced drag, allowing the aircraft to maintain high speed efficiently. In maneuvering tests, the Mustang demonstrated balanced handling. It was not necessarily superior in every aspect of tight turning combat at low altitude, but it was fast, very fast, and stable as a gun platform. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns provided consistent firepower with high ammunition capacity. The aircraft's range, combined with external drop tacks, was something Germany could not easily match by 1944. The Luftwaffe lacked a comparable long-range escort fighter capable of sustained high-altitude operations over enemy territory. For Wolfram, the realization was not emotional, it was professional. He was an experienced combat pilot evaluating another aircraft, and by most accounts, his conclusion was measured but clear. The Mustang was a fine airplane. That phrase carried weight precisely because it came from a man who had spent years mastering Germany's premier fighter. It was not propaganda, it was assessment. What made this evaluation unsettling for German leadership was not admiration for the enemy's engineering, it was what the aircraft represented. The Mustang embodied Allied industrial capacity, aerodynamic research, and strategic clarity. It was not just technically sound, it was purpose-built for the specific challenge of long-range escort warfare. Germany, by contrast, had focused heavily on interceptor development and short-range defense. The strategic contexts were different, and by 1944, those differences mattered. German test pilots and engineers were not blind to innovation. The Luftwaffe had fielded advanced designs throughout the war, and Germany would later introduce jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me-262. But technology alone could not compensate for fuel shortages, disrupted production lines, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied forces. Even if the Bf-109 or Fw-190 could match the Mustang in certain performance envelopes, the Americans could deploy Mustangs in numbers Germany struggled to counter. Wolfram's flight did not instantly change policy. It did not reverse the tide of the air war, but it confirmed something many frontline pilots already suspected. The enemy's fighter was not merely adequate, it was strategically decisive. When Mustangs appeared over Berlin, they were not at the limit of their range. They were operating confidently, aggressively, and in coordination with massive bomber formations. For experienced Luftwaffe cases, this created a new psychological reality. Skill still mattered, tactics still mattered, but increasingly they were fighting against a system, an interconnected network of escort fighters, heavy bombers, radar coordination, and industrial supply that could absorb losses and continue advancing. The Mustang was one visible symbol of that system. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly remarked that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Whether spoken exactly in those words or not, the sentiment reflected a strategic truth. The appearance of long-range escorts over the German capital meant that no target was beyond reach. Air superiority was no longer contested on equal terms. For Walter Wolfram, stepping out of the Mustang after his evaluation flight must have carried a quiet recognition. He had faced the aircraft in combat, he had now flown it himself, and while loyalty and duty bound him to continue fighting, the technical verdict was unavoidable. The balance of performance, range, and industrial backing behind the P-51 Mustang signaled that the Luftwaffe was no longer dictating the terms of the air war. The test flight was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no speeches, no immediate consequences, but in that controlled evaluation, an experienced German ace confirmed something the skies over Europe were already revealing. The advantage had shifted. And once that shift became undeniable, even the most skilled pilots could do little more than fight against the inevitable.
By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a decisive phase. The United States Army Air Forces were committed to a strategy of daylight precision bombing, targeting aircraft factories, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, rail hubs, and synthetic fuel facilities deep inside Germany. Previous missions without reliable long-range escort had resulted in heavy losses. Schweinfurt in 1943 had demonstrated that even heavily armed B-17 formations could not survive sustained interception alone. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed that equation permanently. When Mustangs began escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, the psychological impact inside Germany was immediate. Berlin was not just another target. It was the capital of the Reich, the symbolic heart of Nazi power. Seeing American fighters circling above it shattered the belief that distance or defensive depth could guarantee safety. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, reportedly remarked that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Whether those exact words were recorded verbatim or not, the meaning behind them reflected a grim reality. Germany's air defense perimeter had been penetrated. The Mustang's range allowed it to remain with bomber formations from takeoff in England to target and return. No longer could German fighters simply wait until escorting aircraft turned back toward the Channel. There were no safe corridors left. As bomber streams approached industrial centers like Leipzig, Hamburg, or Berlin, Mustangs were already overhead, climbing to intercept German formations before coordinated attacks could even begin. The tactical consequences were severe. The Luftwaffe had relied on concentrated, high-speed attacks against bomber formations, often using heavy fighters or specially armed interceptors to break apart the defensive boxes. But with Mustangs aggressively patrolling around the bombers, German fighters were forced into defensive engagements before they could line up on their primary targets. Instead of choosing when and where to attack, they increasingly found themselves reacting to Allied fighters that dictated the tempo. Losses began to mount at an unsustainable rate. In the first months of 1944, during what American airmen later called Big Week, Allied forces launched coordinated strikes against German aircraft production facilities. The goal was not only to destroy factories, but to draw the Luftwaffe into battle. German fighter units responded in force, determined to defend their industrial base. The result was intense aerial combat and heavy attrition. While the Allies could replace both aircraft and pilots at high rates, Germany struggled to do the same. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. Allied bombing targeted synthetic fuel plants, crippling Germany's ability to supply aviation gasoline. Training hours for new pilots were reduced dramatically. By 1944, some replacement pilots entered combat with a fraction of the flight experience that earlier Luftwaffe aces had received. Against seasoned Allied escort groups flying high-performance Mustangs, these inexperienced pilots faced overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, Mustang units expanded their mission profile. They were no longer limited to close escort. American commanders encouraged aggressive fighter sweeps, allowing P-51s to range ahead of bomber formations and seek out German aircraft in the air and on the ground. Airfields became targets. Mustangs strafed runways, hangars, and parked aircraft. German fighters attempting to take off were vulnerable during climb-out. Even landing became dangerous, as Allied fighters sometimes waited near known bases. This shift marked a transformation from contested airspace to increasing Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe was not immediately destroyed. It continued to fight fiercely, but its freedom of action was shrinking. German pilots began to avoid direct engagement with large formations of Mustangs whenever possible. Encounters still occurred, and skilled aces could still claim victories, but the balance was clearly unfavorable. Strategically, the protection provided by Mustangs enabled sustained bombing of critical infrastructure. Oil production facilities, transportation networks, and aircraft factories were repeatedly struck. As oil supplies dwindled, German armored divisions and air units alike felt the consequences. Aircraft without fuel were useless. Pilots without sufficient flight hours could not maintain combat effectiveness. The air war's outcome was no longer determined solely by individual dogfights. It was shaped by logistics and industry. The visual image of Mustangs escorting bombers over Berlin symbolized this transformation. It was not merely about one aircraft outperforming another. It was about integrated strategy. Radar coordination, long-range escort, mass production, and relentless operational tempo combined into a system that Germany struggled to counter. Even the introduction of advanced aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter could not fully reverse the trend. Jets required fuel, trained pilots, and protected airfields, all resources under increasing strain. For experienced Luftwaffe pilots such as Walter Wolfram, the skies over Germany in 1944 were fundamentally different from the early war years. Instead of isolated engagements over distant fronts, they faced vast formations backed by industrial might. Each mission carried greater risk. Each loss was harder to replace. The presence of Mustangs over Berlin underscored that the defensive battle was being fought on Germany's doorstep. By late 1944, Allied air superiority was largely established. Bombing missions continued with decreasing opposition. German fighter units still resisted, sometimes inflicting painful losses, but the initiative had shifted permanently. The Mustang's long-range capability ensured that the bombers it protected could operate with increasing confidence and consistency.
By the final year of the war in Europe, the question was no longer whether Germany could regain air superiority. The question was how long it could continue resisting under relentless pressure. The P-51 Mustang had become more than just an escort fighter. It was a visible symbol of Allied dominance in the air. Its presence over Germany reflected a deeper shift, one driven not only by aerodynamics and engines, but by production capacity, fuel access, and strategic coordination. In 1944 and early 1945, the Luftwaffe faced a crisis that no single aircraft could solve. German industry had once been capable of producing advanced fighters in impressive numbers. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190 remained formidable machines in experienced hands. Technological innovation had not disappeared from Germany. The introduction of the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter demonstrated that German engineers were still capable of groundbreaking design. But innovation requires stability, resources, and time. Three things Germany increasingly lacked. Fuel was perhaps the most decisive factor. Allied bombing campaigns targeted synthetic fuel plants, including major facilities in places like Lona and Politz. Without sufficient aviation gasoline, pilot training programs were drastically reduced. New recruits sometimes entered combat with fewer than 100 flight hours, compared to the extensive preparation earlier in the war. Against Allied pilots flying Mustangs, many of whom had substantial training and operational support, this imbalance proved fatal. The Mustang's role extended beyond simple escort. Its range allowed it to patrol rail lines, strafe supply convoys, and disrupt transportation networks critical to German war efforts. By maintaining constant pressure, Allied air forces restricted the movement of troops and equipment. Even when German fighters were available, they often lacked fuel to respond effectively. Airfields themselves became vulnerable, with Mustangs conducting low-level attacks that destroyed aircraft before they could even take off. For veteran pilots like Walter Wolfram, the final phase of the war demanded adaptation rather than optimism. Experience still counted. Skilled aces could exploit fleeting opportunities, diving into bomber formations or engaging isolated fighters, but the broader environment was unforgiving. Allied numerical superiority meant that even successful engagements carried risk of being overwhelmed by additional enemy aircraft. Attrition favored the side that could replace losses quickly, and that side was no longer Germany. Production figures illustrate the scale of the disparity. The United States produced thousands of P-51 Mustangs between 1943 and 1945, alongside vast numbers of bombers and other fighters. Factories operated beyond the reach of enemy attack, supplied by abundant raw materials and protected by geographic distance. German factories, by contrast, operated under constant threat of bombardment. Even when aircraft rolled off assembly lines, shortages of fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots limited their operational impact. The Mustang's design itself embodied strategic clarity. It was not overly complex. It balanced speed, range, and firepower in a way that met the practical demands of long-range escort warfare. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag at cruising speeds, conserving fuel over long distances. The Merlin engine provided reliable high-altitude performance. 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered sustained, consistent firepower. None of these features alone guaranteed victory, but together they created a system aligned perfectly with Allied objectives. As Allied ground forces advanced across Western Europe following the Normandy landings, air superiority played a critical role. Mustangs and other fighters attacked German reinforcements,
disrupted logistics, and provided cover for advancing armies. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest the skies effectively limited Germany's capacity to maneuver or concentrate forces. The air war was no longer an isolated theater. It directly influenced outcomes on the ground. By early 1945, the sight of Allied aircraft over German cities had become routine. Resistance continued, but it was fragmented and constrained. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of rapid and devastating power, struggled to mount coordinated defenses. Even advanced aircraft like the Me-262, though capable of high speed, were introduced too late and in insufficient numbers to reverse the tide. They also required experienced pilots and reliable fuel supplies, resources already depleted. Walter Wolfram survived the war, a testament to his skill and adaptability, but his experience with the captured P-51 Mustang had foreshadowed what the final year would confirm. The aircraft represented more than technical competence. It represented a shift in industrial and strategic balance that Germany could not overcome. Individual bravery and tactical ingenuity could not compensate for systemic disadvantage. In the end, the Mustang did not win the war alone. Victory in Europe resulted from coordinated efforts across multiple fronts: land, sea, and air. But the P-51 played a decisive role in securing air superiority, enabling sustained strategic bombing, and protecting Allied forces as they advanced. Its long-range escort capability closed the final gaps in Germany's defensive perimeter. When historians examine why the Luftwaffe failed to defend the Reich in 1944 and 1945, they point to many factors: fuel shortages, pilot attrition, industrial disruption, and overwhelming Allied production. The P-51 Mustang stands at the intersection of those factors. It was the aircraft that exposed vulnerabilities, exploited strategic weaknesses, and ensured that bomber formations could operate without isolation. For German aces who once dominated the skies, the realization was gradual but undeniable. The balance of power had shifted beyond recovery. The Mustang's silhouette against the European sky symbolized that transformation, a reminder that in modern war, technological innovation must be matched by sustainable production and strategic foresight. Without those, even the most experienced pilots could only delay the inevitable.